Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vipers Network. This is an extension of Viper Bites as we look at Week 14 fantasy football facts and stats. And I kick things off here with Thursday Night Football because there's something that we need to talk about in this New England versus Pittsburgh game. And you know what? It's not going to be pretty, but they don't ask you how. They ask you how many when it comes to fantasy football. So here's a couple of stats for Thursday Night Football that could help you out this week, starting with the Patriots. Hey, we know that they lost Ramondre Stevenson last week, but Ezekiel Elliott, he automatically becomes a bell cow back this week. Last week when Stevenson went down, 16 out of the 16 rushing attempts. He saw 5 targets. He played 93% of the snaps. You add that all up here against the Pittsburgh Steelers team that, by the way, they've been pretty good defensively against running backs. The volume is going to matter. Now, he may only get like 3-4 yards per rushing attempt, but when you break it all down, Elliott is going to have a nice fantasy week when it's all said and done. Expect him to be a low RB2. Now, on the other side of the field, you got one of the more explosive running backs in the NFL in Jaylen Warren. I talked about him being an explosive option here on Thursday night, especially if Najee Harris were to be limited or miss time in this one. Over the last 4 weeks, it's not going to be an easy task because this Patriots defense has allowed fewer fantasy points to opposing running backs than any other team out there. But again, this is all about opportunities because opportunities matter when it comes to fantasy football, especially when we're talking about a back as explosive as Jaylen Warren has been. The more opportunities he has, the better chance we see him go off on a boom type play a la DK Metcalf. Now, Warren, since week number 8, has 14 runs greater than 10 yards, which happens to be the most in the NFL. Now, heading over to Atlanta to talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons. Rachaad White is a must-start back each and every single week. If you follow any of my starts and sits videos that I have out there, you already know this, especially when it comes to PPR formats. Since week number 7, the RB3 in fantasy, averaging 18.6 fantasy points per game, and he has finished as a top 10 fantasy back in 3 of the last 5 contests. Why all the success? Since week number 7, White ranks 3rd in snap share there at 80.8%, 3rd in carries at 106, 4th in targets at 34. You add that all up, and that is volume, people, and volume, again, it matters here. And also, Mike Evans, the future Hall of Famer, you're going to start him this week. AJ Terrell, he's in concussion protocol, and if he misses this game, Evans, he's going to put up 150-plus yards. Now, on the other side of the field, Arthur Smith may have finally figured out how to use Bijan Robinson, especially over the last 3 weeks, in which Robinson has accounted for 301 yards and 63 touches. His snap share, it has increased throughout the season, and he faces a Bucs team that we just saw Chuba Hubbard run for 104 yards last week, not to mention a pair of touchdowns. So you can feel pretty good about Bijan Robinson in this game. Then again, it is Arthur Smith, so maybe temper those expectations. Our next stop on this tour is Baltimore, where the Rams take on the Ravens. Now, I continue to doubt Kyren Williams, but maybe you should not. Now, one of the reasons I am doubting him this week is this Ravens defense is a top 10 defensive unit against running backs when it comes to fantasy football. Then again, I've basically been wrong on Kyren Williams every step of the way. Despite missing 4 weeks, Williams is the RB12 right now with 169.7 fantasy points. And he's only failed to hit double-digit fantasy points in 2 games this season. If you haven't figured out the theme of the show this week, volume matters. Well, Kyren Williams, 82% of the snap share. There's no one there in Los Angeles that's going to take snaps out of his backfield. It's not going to be Royce Freeman. We saw that last week. Trust me, I tried to start Royce Freeman in one of my leagues. It didn't work out so well. Now, on the other sideline here, if you're looking for a tight end, look no further than Isaiah Likely, who was second last week for the Ravens in route share rate at 69.4%, while leading the Ravens in yards and placing second in targets, holding 4 of his 5 targets, accounting for a 16% target share, which is not too bad for a tight end. Los Angeles is allowing 12.5 fantasy points per game to the position over the last 4 weeks, so Likely finds himself in a great spot for you this week. Now, heading over to Chicago for the Detroit Lions and the Chicago Bears. Chicago has allowed just 3 passing touchdowns while picking off the opposition on 7 occasions over the last 4 weeks. They're allowing just 9.15 fantasy points to quarterbacks, which happens to be the second fewest over that time. And that includes a game against Jared Goff, in which he was picked off on 3 separate occasions there. These teams met back in Detroit just a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to fade Jared Goff, but I'm not fading David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs because This Lions offense is going to need to run the ball to get past this Chicago team this week. Now for Chicago, DJ Moore, 14th in receptions this season, 9th in receiving yards, and 4th in yards after the catch. And he faces a Lions secondary that has allowed 765 receiving yards and 7 scores to receivers over the previous 4 contests there, which works out to about 43.13 fantasy points per game, or the 3rd most. Over Fields' last 6 full games, Moore has had 13 or more fantasy points in every single one. Now, heading off to Cincinnati, we're talking Colts, we're talking Bengals here. 10 plus fantasy points every game this season, except for week number 4. 41 targets over the Colts' last 3 games. And since week 6, Michael Pittman has seen double-digit targets in 5 of 7 contests. Pittman is him, especially with Gardner Minshew under center. No fewer than 22% of a target share when Minshew's been there. And we're talking about 5 games over that period of time in which that target share has been over 27%. Pretty good reason why he's got 8 catches in 6 of the last 8 games, and why Pittman is the wide receiver 7 in fantasy since week number 6. Now, for the Bengals, matchups matter, and for Chase, this is a great one. Indianapolis is one of those teams that likes to sit back and run zone coverage. They run it about 84% of the time, and they rarely bring that extra defender after the quarterback. Outside of Keenan Allen, no wide receiver has a greater target share versus zone coverage than Chase's 29%. Chase has 12 or more fantasy points in 8 of his last 10 contests. Yeah, I think Ja'Marr Chase has a real good chance at being the number 1 wide receiver this week. Now, heading to Cleveland, we're talking Jaguars, we're talking Browns. Back in week number 1, this could have been a heavyweight battle. Now we're just wondering who's going to win the war of attrition when it comes to this contest. At one point, the Cleveland Browns were one of the best teams in fantasy at limiting the opposing running backs. Now they have basically dropped to 14th over the last 4 weeks because they're giving up about 24 fantasy points per game to the position, or the 8th most. So really, this is one of those games I think you can go back and trust Travis Etienne, especially with the loss of Trevor Lawrence and Christian Kirk. Etienne, he faces a Browns defense that is giving up 5.1 yards per carry over the last 6 weeks, and they've allowed nearly 700 yards and 6 scores on the ground. Now for the Cleveland Browns, please, please, please let Joe Flacco be under center for this one. We saw that rapport between Flacco and Elijah Moore pay off again last week, much like it did back in their Jets days. Moore saw 12 targets, and he accounted for a league-high 257 air yards. No other wide receiver last week had more than 257 air yards. No other wide receiver this season at any point has had more than 257 air yards in any single game. So I feel good about Elijah Moore as long as Joe Flacco is there. Now, heading to the Bayou, we're talking Carolina, we're talking the Saints, and it is hard to trust any Panther in fantasy football but Chuba Hubbard. We know none of these wide receivers are getting separation, so Bryce Young, he's out of the equation. Adam Thielen, can't trust him. Jonathan Mingo, not a chance. But Chuba Hubbard, back-to-back 20-point fantasy performances. Since the Panthers basically fired everybody there, including Deuce Staley, we've seen more opportunities funnel towards Chuba Hubbard here in recent weeks. And I expect that to continue this week against the Saints, and I expect Hubbard to be productive again, as the Saints have allowed 647 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns over the last 5 weeks. Now, for the Saints, Michael Thomas, he's on IR. Rashid Shaheed, he's dealing with that quad injury, which means all systems are go for Chris Olave, who has seen 25 targets and converted that into 327 yards over his last 8 full quarters. Adding to all of that, Jameis Winston could be under center, which is good news for Chris Olave, who has a 38% target share when Winston is under center. And he's also added up to about 24 fantasy points per game when that happens. Now, speaking of happening, Houston, their offense is still going to happen this week against the New York Jets. Yes, I said it. I know it's okay. We lost Tank Dell here. I get it. We lost Tank Dell, but it's no reason to start mourning right now because it's not the end for Nico Collins. When Dell hasn't been on the field, Collins, he's been productive. 30.8% target share, 28.5% targets per route run. He's also had 40% of the Texans' air yard share. Even in a tough matchup here in week number 14 against the Jets, Collins is going to be heavily involved. As for the Jets team, it's okay to trust Garrett Wilson in PPR leagues this week. Over the last 4 weeks, the Texans are allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to the position. And if there's one thing that Zach Wilson knows how to do, it is target Garrett Wilson. In 10 starts in which Zach Wilson has been under center, Garrett Wilson has averaged 10.3 targets per game. That is the 6th most amongst wide receivers. He's also averaged 5.7 receptions and 65.1 yards per contest. Now heading to Vegas, we got Minnesota taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. And after missing the Vikings' last 7 games, Justin Jefferson returns just in time to face the 9th worst team in fantasy when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. Yes, the Raiders are allowing 38.9 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks there, and they have conceded 546 yards and 3 scores over the last 3 games. Remember, there's a bye week thrown in there that kind of convolutes everything. Now, Jefferson, he's about as quarterback proof as you can be, but Graham Barfield, he pointed out that Dobbs throws a catchable ball at about a 69.4% rate there. Meanwhile, Kirk Cousins was throwing that at about 80% of his attempts, so there could be an adjustment in this game. For the Raiders offense, this Vikings team this season is allowing 36.49 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And you know what? I'll give them the credit. They've been better as of lately, but so have Aiden O'Connell and Davante Adams. That connection has now hooked up for 70-plus yards in 3 straight contests. And that includes games against the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a pretty good duo of corners there, and the New York Jets. If you remember, Davante Adams, he went all out in that one. Now, heading to San Francisco for the contest there between the Seahawks and the 49ers. Everybody is talking about rookie breakouts here, but yet no one's mentioning Jackson Smith-Njigba's name in that category. I get it. DK Metcalf, he basically did unthinkable things to DeBron Bland last week, but lost in all of that was the fact that JSN, he had 11 targets. Since week 9, JSN has had 2 fewer receptions than Tyler Lockett, and he's had just as many receptions as DK Metcalf. So we know that Geno Smith, he's spreading that pigskin all around his wide receivers. Now, when looking at this 49ers team this season, they have allowed fantasy points to wide receivers here at the 8th most clip there on a per-game basis. So you know what, Seattle, they may not be able to run this game. In fact, their running game could be phased out completely because San Francisco is so good against the run. But this is one of the things we could see plenty of action in the passing game. Now, speaking of that passing game, how about Brock Purdy not only being an NFL MVP candidate, but considering where you drafted him in fantasy football, he should be the fantasy football MVP. Purdy has 20 or more fantasy points in 4 of the 49ers' previous 5 games. Purdy is also averaging 9.6 yards per target, completing 70% of his passes, and averaging 265 yards per game. It helps when you have targets like Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. And Seattle is another one of those teams that loves to run zone coverage at about 84% of the time, which means Purdy to Samuel is a great stack this week. Why Samuel? 24% target share versus zone, 3.02 yards per route run versus zone coverage, much better than Brandon Ayuk's numbers. Now, a heavyweight battle here this week. Maybe it's kind of the appetizer, but we got the Buffalo Bills versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, stealing from Fantasy Points' very own Graham Barfield, no defense plays more too high safety coverage than the Chiefs at 66.9%. In 6 games since Dalton Kincaid emerged as that number 1 tight end, as that starter in Buffalo, Diggs has garnered just 32.2% of those first read targets and averages just 1.88 yards per route run against too high coverage. Now, this compares to 37% of first read and a 2.37 yards per route run earlier on in the season before Kincaid took over that starter's role. Basically, what I'm telling you here is Kincaid has matched Diggs stride for stride since coming to the starting lineup. So that means he should be in your starting lineup for fantasy this week. Now, over the last 4 weeks, the Buffalo Bills defense, they've been good against wide receivers. That said, Buffalo, they're going to have their hands full on Travis Kelce. He should be priority 1, which is going to lead to more opportunities for Rashee Rice as he continues his breakout campaign here late in the 2023 season. Rice has led this team here in targets in each of the last 2 weeks with about 19 of them, which is 7 more than Travis Kelce has seen over that period. Rice also in the last 2 weeks has a 28% target share there and accounted for 171 receiving yards while only seeing 65% route run rate, which is pretty good. Expect that route run rate to go up, which means more opportunities, more targets, more yards, and more fantasy points, which is what we all love. Now heading to Los Angeles, we have the Denver Broncos taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. Courtland Sutton comes in this one having scored 9 touchdowns in the Broncos' previous 13 contests this season. The Chargers, they've allowed 13 touchdowns to wide receivers in 13 weeks. So it's easy to make a connection here in which Courtland Sutton finds the end zone once again this week. And over the last 4 weeks, the Chargers have allowed 4 touchdowns and 640 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. And one of those games for the Chargers came against the New England Patriots, who have no wide receivers to begin with. Dare I say it, the Wilson to Sutton connection has been cooking all season long. And after watching this Chargers offense last week against that said New England Patriots team, I'm not sure I can trust Justin Herbert. I'm not even sure I can trust Austin Eckler, who, by the way, Coach Staley was talking about maybe a committee approach here in Los Angeles this week to maybe get the 5-7 Chargers back on track. Now, one of the best pass defenses in the league here in the Denver Broncos, led by Patrick Surtain, has held opposing wide receivers to the second fewest fantasy points in the last 4 weeks. But here's the kicker. They face one of the best fantasy wide receivers this season in Keenan Allen, who is first in receptions at 102, third in yards with 1,175, and third in touchdowns with 7. Even in a game in which the Chargers could do nothing offensively, Allen, he still had 10.8 fantasy points in that game without even scoring a touchdown. Allen, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy production just one time this season and has 22 fantasy points or more in 3 of the last 4 games. Ding, 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 ding. We have the Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys Sunday Night Football game of the week. But can you trust Devontae Smith in this one? Probably not. Dallas Goedert's potential return this week is bad news for Smith. It has no effect on A.J. Brown, who's had success with Goedert in the lineup, but Smith is one who takes the hit. With Goedert in the lineup over the last 2 seasons, Smith has seen 1.4 fewer targets per game, 20 fewer receiving yards per game, and 3.5 fewer fantasy points per game. So for me, if I see Goedert in the lineup, I'm probably taking a step back on Smith and looking for some other options out there. Now, other options may include one of these Dallas Cowboys wide receivers. We know Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. That is going to be the fantasy focal point this week. But since week number 10, Brandon Cooks is averaging more than 18 fantasy points per game and 4 games in which he's had double-digit fantasy production. Remember, this is an Eagles team that is allowing 49.37 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the second most in the NFL. Here we go. Only a couple more games. We're heading to Monday night now. We've got Tennessee at Miami. The Titans are heading to South Beach. And Miami, they have allowed just 183 yards on the ground to opposing backs over the last 4 weeks. Not to mention the third fewest fantasy points to running backs over that period. But I've counted Derrick Henry out before, probably more times than I probably should. And I'm not willing to do it again, especially since he has no concussion this week. You're going to start him. If the Titans are to keep this game close, and that's a big if, they're going to need to run the ball. Miami, they're allowing the third fewest rushing yards this season, but they're also allowing 4.1 yards per carry. Why is that? Because game script have often got teams behind the count here when it comes to this Miami Dolphins offense. So if you want to keep up with the Dolphins, you've got to keep the ball out of Tua Tagovailoa's hand, and the best way to do that is to give it to Derrick Henry. Now, speaking of running backs, let's talk about the Miami Dolphins running back here, Devin Achane, who doesn't necessarily need the ball to be a top running back. In fact, if you want him to be a top 5 running back in fantasy, all he needs is basically like 7 snaps. Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points points out that in 4 games which Achane exceeded 7 snaps, he's averaging 31.8 fantasy points per game. And he's doing that on just like 13.5 carries, which translates into 9.78 yards per carry, 3.5 targets, and 15.1 expected fantasy points per game. Tennessee, we know they're already battling some injuries there, especially on that defensive front, with Jeffrey Simmons likely to miss this game. So we could see plenty of Devin Achane and Raheem Mostert in this one. Remember, Raheem Mostert has 14 rushing touchdowns this season. He's probably going to hit 15 and 16 this week. Now, finally, let's close things off here with the Green Bay Packers headed to New York to take on the New York Giants. The Packers, they have their franchise quarterback. Yes, I will say that. I'm ready to put that officially out there. Over the last 3 games, he's thrown for 850 plus yards, 8 touchdowns, no interceptions. And apparently that is something that has never been done in the history of the National Football League. Not by Brett Favre, not by Aaron Rodgers, only by Jordan Love. This week, he faces a Giants secondary that has allowed 18.85 fantasy points per game, 817 passing yards, and 5 touchdowns to the quarterback position over the last 4 weeks. And I don't trust any New York Giants when it comes to fantasy football, except maybe Saquon Barkley this week, because the Packers have yielded 500 rushing yards, 69 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 weeks. In terms of fantasy, that's about 24 fantasy points per game, or the 10th most. Now, Barkley, he's going to get volume. There's that word again, volume, as he's seen at least a 77% snap share in each of the last 4 weeks. That hasn't always necessarily meant fantasy production, but against the Packers, that should set him up nicely to produce. And if you want to produce in your fantasy lineups, make sure to hit that like button, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and make sure you're following the Vipers Network for all the latest fantasy football news. We'll see you next week.